So we're looking at the age of Jackson. So President Andrew Jackson is going to be our president, and his era, his time in office, is called the Jacksonian democracy, or the age of Jackson. So when we look, first you need to look at the election of 1824. So it's going to be versus John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams is the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams. And John Adams was a Federalist, and now his son is a Democrat Republican. This is the era of good feelings, okay? So when you look at this time period, the era of good feelings, it dies here at this election. Presidential candidate John Quincy Adams is a guy who Jackson is going to claim was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. John Quincy Adams had a fancy education. You know, he was a lawyer. He was an ambassador for the United States. He's actually the guy who wrote the Monroe Doctrine. He has a prestigious political background. Whereas presidential candidate Andrew Jackson is the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. He's been the governor of Tennessee. He's kind of a rough and tumble guy. He was a drinker. He was a gambler. He was a duelist. A duelist was somebody who fought with guns another person who maybe insulted their honor. You know, John Quincy Adams, he's from the north, he's from Boston, and Jackson is from the south. He's from Tennessee, which is really considered a western state. Adams is a lawyer, and Jackson's a plantation owner. And so these guys are just going to have this horrible time in the election of 1824. They name call, they mudsling, they do everything possible to each other to damage the reputation of one another. And by the time people go and actually vote, they got John Quincy Adams, who's the son of a former president, who's been painted as this guy who has never had to work at all in his life, which isn't true. His dad was really harsh to him. And then Andrew Jackson, who is a common man, who has worked his way up. You know, he was born with nothing, and now he's this great big plantation owner. He's got money. And so what people are going to choose is a division. There's no clear winner in the Electoral College. Adams doesn't clearly win, and Jackson doesn't clearly win, because these two titans are battling it out. The Electoral College can't decide who's going to actually be the President of the United States. And when there's a tie in the Electoral College, remember, the House of Representatives gets to choose who's going to be the president. So John Quincy Adams is chosen over Andrew Jackson to become president. Jackson is absolutely furious. He feels like he's won. And the reason why he feels he's won is that he had the popular vote, the people's vote. But remember, the popular vote doesn't matter in the presidency. It's only the Electoral College vote that matters. So Jackson is kind of a sore loser in a lot of ways. And so for the rest of the 4 years until the election of 1828, Jackson goes around claiming that a corrupt bargain has been struck. This corrupt bargain was between Speaker of the House of Representatives Henry Clay and Adams. So Henry Clay actually does persuade the House of Representatives to vote in favor of Adams. And he believes that Adams is going to be the better president. Adams has a level head. Jackson is known to have a hot temper. And so Henry Clay says, you know, this is going to be the better guy to be our president. And so he swings the votes, or at least he persuades enough of his people to go ahead and vote for John Quincy Adams to be the president. Jackson says that's the corrupt bargain because he should have had the presidency. Clay is given a cabinet position, so that means he's an advisor to the President of the United States. He's the Secretary of State, which is a higher position than the House of Representatives Speaker, at least in Clay's opinion. So Clay gets to be the Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams gets to be the president, and Jackson has to pack his bags and go back to his Tennessee plantation. And so for the next 4 years, Jackson and his supporters are going to form the Democrat Party, which is a new political party, and they're going to oppose Adams' policies. So Adams becomes ineffective pretty much for the next 4 years because every time he tries to do something, Jackson and his Democrat followers are basically going to talk smack. They're going to talk junk all the time about President John Quincy Adams. So Adams might try to do great things, but he's never going to be able to get anything done because every time he makes a move and says, no, that's not what I want, no, that's not what's going to happen, Jackson's basically saying, yeah, it is. Or vice versa. Whatever the issue is, Jackson's always going to take the opposite side. So this corrupt bargain. When you look, John Quincy Adams has all these New England states, which is typical. I mean, that's where the guy's from. Andrew Jackson has all the yellow ones. And you got some other people running too. Henry Clay's actually running to be president too. You see he wins like 4. Not that many. But if you look, Andrew Jackson, the electoral vote, he had 99. John Quincy Adams had 84. When you look at popular vote, Jackson clearly wins it. And so this is why Jackson feels that a corrupt bargain's been actually struck, that he got cheated out of the presidency because his daddy wasn't the president. I mean, nobody even knows anything about Jackson's dad, and John Quincy Adams uses that in his little campaign against Jackson. So basically for the next 4 years, John Quincy Adams gets the presidency, but he gets nothing accomplished because of Jackson. So let's look at this guy, Jackson. Jackson's home as a child in Tennessee. You see a little log cabin. Jackson and President Abraham Lincoln are going to be compared a lot because Jackson's a common man, and so is Lincoln. Lincoln's going to be a common man too, who's born in a log cabin, right? Taught himself how to read and write, all that good stuff. He really did teach himself all that stuff. The guy was pretty freaking smart. And Jackson's actually smart too. I mean, he teaches himself how to do everything as well. This is a painting of Jackson in 1815. This is after he had already accomplished the Battle of New Orleans. So back then, you paint pictures and you send them out, and that was kind of like a poster. It was kind of like a card that said, hey, I won, remember me? Remember me as a hero? They don't have TV commercials, okay? Today, they would just do TV commercials. And then you would do like a 2020 interview with Barbara Walters. So here's a painting of Jackson during his fight with the Seminole Indians, and he basically massacres the crap out of the Seminoles in the Florida area. He uses them to help him win at the Battle of New Orleans, but then he goes and he kills them all because Jackson's policy on the American Indians is that he feels that they cannot assimilate, that they need to die or get out of his way. He's not really a guy who sees gray areas. He's very much a guy who sees black and white. You're either with him or you're against him. There is no middle grounds with this kind of man. In the election of 1828, there's going to be a really high voter turnout. And the big reason why there's a high voter turnout is most of the states had went ahead and they've reduced the voting requirements, and the country itself has reduced it. So voting requirements are lowered. Now you have universal white man suffrage. Now all white men can actually vote. Before, only white land-owning men could vote. Now all landless, poor white guys can vote. And because Jackson was one of these kind of guys, or at least that's how he paints himself out to be, he appealed to them, and he appeals to them, and so he goes to the common man. So because of the lower voting requirements, Jackson's going to win. And when Jackson wins the presidency, he's going to become the first Western president. Tennessee is really considered the West. And so now Jackson has won, and he's a guy who holds on to some anger. And he's going to go ahead and decide to go after everybody who he feels disfamed or discredited his image. And his Rachel, his beloved wife, dies. And so he's definitely going after a lot of people. Voting rights in the early 19th century. So you can look, property requirements in 1800, just about every state. Okay, now property requirements, not really that big. Only North Carolina and Tennessee, where Jackson's actually from. In North Carolina, one of the poorest of the southern states. Voter turnout, 1820 to 1860. Look at this. 1824, you don't have that many because you don't have the common white man being able to vote. Now look, common white man can vote, you double. And you're going to see in the elections where there's a lot of contention, a lot of things that are starting to kind of become, whether we should do it or not. Like in the election of 1844, the annexation of Texas, you see a lot of people come out and vote. And then look at the 1860 election, you see a lot of people coming out actually and voting. So the elections where there's a lot of contention, where there's a lot of disagreement, sectional issues in our country, you're always going to see people coming out and voting. The election of 1828, here's the results. Look at that. Jackson clearly sweeps it. Clearly sweeps it at this point. I mean, there's no other way to look at it. Washington's inaugural address, this is how Washington is dressed. Here's Jackson. See the difference? Washington, formal, above, Washington's very concerned about his image. I mean, this is a guy who would write a letter 20 times to make certain that it was absolutely perfect. And if he made a mistake, he threw out the whole letter and restarted. Here's Jackson's. There's definitely a pig being barbecued in this one. These are common people who are there. They're drinking beer, and everybody's at the White House. Like, everybody. You've got somebody who's rather kind of poor here. You've got some fancy rich people here. I mean, but you have everybody. Because he's the common man's president, and people just all come there to the White House. Actually, they break stuff when they get into the White House. They're like having barroom fights and stuff in there. It's like crazy. It's like a frat party. Jackson's presidency. He's going to create the spoils system. The spoils system is to the victor goes the spoils of war. And Jackson has just won a hard-fought war, so he decides that he's going to reward all his wonderful campaign supporters with jobs, whether they're qualified for it or not. So if you supported Jackson, you joined the Democrat Party, and for the last 4 years you've been saying to the country, you better vote for Jackson in the election of 1828, you get a job in his administration, whether you're qualified for it or not. So if you can't add and you get the Secretary of Treasury position, everybody in the country is screwed, because that deals with money, and that definitely deals with math. Greater democracy, because more white men are actually able to vote. Women and minorities are going to be ignored. Jackson never talks about slavery himself. Now, he does actually free all of his slaves before he becomes the president. He'll actually sell them, free some. And the reason why he does it is because he doesn't feel that as a president he should also be a plantation owner. He feels that there's a conflict of interest, so he decides to get rid of the plantation system. The Indian policy, Jackson is going to be different than a lot of people. He doesn't believe in assimilation. He actually believes in forcefully removing the American Indians. I mean, but hey, he did kill a lot of the Seminoles in the Seminole Wars in Florida. I mean, and he does that. He doesn't even have permission to do it, but he does it anyway. So the Indian Removal Act in 1830 is right up his alley. He's going to forcibly remove the American Indians from the land. And the 5 nations are going to be removed. So here's the Cherokee after 1820. Here's where they're actually settled. And here's the actual Indian Removal Act map. So the 5 nations are going to be forcibly removed, whether they like it or not. And they're going to be removed here to the Indian Territories, which you guys know is Oklahoma. And they're going to be settled in reservations. So reservations is land set aside just for them. It's not great land. It's the crappiest land we can possibly find and give it to them. They're not allowed to step off the reservation. So if the buffalo don't wander onto the Indian reservation, then the American Indians don't get to eat for a while. So it's a horrible system. It is a system that is essentially meant to keep them poor and to kill them. So the Indian policy continuing. Westchester versus Georgia is a Supreme Court case. This group of Cherokees in Georgia are being forcibly removed from their land by Georgia, and so they sue. And so the Cherokees sue, and what ends up happening is they appeal, they lose in the state, and so they appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hears their case. And what ends up happening is the Cherokee are going to be ruled as a domestic nation, a nation. And if you're a nation, that means only the United States can talk to you. So the Cherokee are going to be ruled as a domestic, independent country. So like they have to actually talk with the United States of America. So, like, it's dependent on the United States. So if the United States wants to make any sort of deal, they do it with the Cherokee, but the state of Georgia can never do it. So the Cherokee, a dependent nation that can only talk and negotiate with the United States government. That states have no rights to actually negotiate or trade or do anything with the American Indians. Jackson's going to ignore the Supreme Court ruling, and he's going to go ahead and order the forceful removal of the American Indians.